But there are situations where women that are pregnant have to get irradiated diagnostically because of medical problems. They could have serious life-threatening problems where they need to get exposed to radiation. And the idea is that the study was done looking at live births in women that were exposed to radiation during their pregnancy and that weren't. And there's all sorts of different doses and dose ranges, all very low doses, but it had to be done. And they looked at 1.8 million live births in Ontario over from 1992 to 2008 and looked at the cancer risk in the offspring that were born to women that were irradiated during their pregnancy and women that weren't. And it was a very nice study that showed that, in fact, you probably don't have to worry too much if you have to get one of these life-saving medical procedures, because it looks like the risk of getting cancers is very low already in the first place. So in the general population, it's about 1.56 cancers per 10,000 live births of the unexposed group. And in the exposed group, there was 1.13 cancers per 10,000 live births. The authors of this study were basically saying this is something that we need to educate people on more, because the fact of the matter is there is not increased cancer risk in their offspring if they have to get a diagnostic procedure. So you can tell them with some certainty, especially with that number of live births, 1.8 million, that the effect on your fetus is not going to be there. So that's a good thing. Now, whether that number is different, the authors did not even mention or argue whether or not that number is lower than the normal population, but it's lower. It looks lower. It's not significant, I don't think, but they never did. I didn't see the stats on it. So,
sorry, Dennis, just going to interrupt.
Yep.
What was the exposure rate for?
Oh, it could be, they had a whole series of,
just an entire
whether, you know, it could be a deep vein thrombosis. A mother's pregnant, she's got to go in, she's going to get scatter radiation when she gets a leg x-ray. Maybe something with the lungs where you got to get a CT scan because part of your heart's having a problem. All the exposures were put into any women that had to go into some kind of diagnostic medical procedure. Doses weren't necessarily calculated precisely, just basically whether you were exposed or not.
Because it's funny, because I know that Labour Canada, in fact, used part of this study as a reason to lower the your millisieverts allowable for pregnant workers. So
yeah, well, that's, and I know right now they're trying to come up with dose limits for medical procedures, which is going to cause a big controversy, I think. Yeah. I mean, if I get 4 chest X-rays this year, and that gives me my annual dose of whatever they're going to set it at, and I got to go and get something because I got a serious life-threatening problem, I'm not going to worry about the limit. Because that's the problem, is that sometimes we do get large doses of diagnostic stuff if we have a serious medical problem. Right. Usually the biggest doses are in people that are overweight and have heart problems. And they're going in to get these x-rays to find out, these fluoroscopies to see if their heart's working, cardiac scans. Well, you're hardly going to say to a person, well, your heart's going to, you know, it could fail on you any minute, but we have to have a look and see. But your risk of getting cancer might be 0.04% over the next 30 years. The guy's going like, I'm not going to worry about that right now. You know, I think this is a fundamental flaw we have, is that we've made the, we jump too quick, we overreact, and that causes all the other stuff that goes with it. This has been known for years. Employees in the nuclear industry are less likely in the general population excuse me, to die from cancer or non-cancer diseases. Excuse me. And that could be said for, like there's lots of arguments why that might be. It might be lifestyle, it might be healthy worker effect. I think you might want to consider, are you considered radiation workers? Not yet, eh?
Not officially.
You don't want
to reclassify us at one point in time because,
yeah.
Because the studies had shown that we were actually starting to exceed the limit.
Well, you're probably getting,
but it was,
yeah, some of these pilots are getting way more, not way more, but they're getting more than a nuclear energy worker would get by a long shot.
Yeah.
That's because there's no radiation exposures around nuclear power stations.
And then they changed the actual, whatever we fall into.
All right. So they modified it.
Yeah. And so ours is the same.
I would say I'd put you in the same category. I don't know.
We're at 6 or something.
And if you look at this book that was published by a guy named Chuck Saunders, he put together a whole bunch of all sorts of different types of cancers in nuclear energy workers and looked at the relative risk of dying of cancer based on your dose of radiation that you get. And this is not annual dose, this is lifetime dose. So it's really low. I mean, but if you look at the green line here represents a relative risk of 1, which is no increased risk. And all the black symbols represent studies that show the risk of getting cancer, whether the black studies show that it's below the line of 1, which means the risk is less. And the red dots represent, at least according to the authors, studies that show a significant increased risk of above 1 of getting cancer. So blacks are below the line, reds are above, decreased risk, increased risk, related to dose that you get over your lifetime. And it seems fairly convincing that many of them fall below the risk of 1, which means there's less risk in these dose ranges until about 100 again. And remember I told you 100 is about where we start seeing things in A-bomb survivors, where there's still studies that show that it may not be increased, but there's some that show there's increase. And certainly the red ones are above the line at the higher dose range, but not below. Again, so just sort of putting sort of what we know in terms of radiation workers and total dose and risk together. There's this book I put in there for a reference for you. We spend a lot of money protecting ourselves from radiation. It's one of the biggest sort of expenditures we have in terms of life saved. If you look at studies that look at how much money do you spend to save a human life? Well, if it's your life, you want to spend billions, right? But if you look at society and how much money we actually have to spend, the economists will put this into perspective in terms of regulations that cost more than $15 million per expected life saved will have a counterproductive effect on individual mortality. Well, how does that work? Well, it means that we're spending more money than we should to save one life when that valuable resource should be used where we can save lives a lot more efficiently and a lot easier and a lot more of them. And there's a chart showing in 2010 dollars example of life-saving interventions and their cost effectiveness in terms of dollars. I know you can't read the numbers, but if we look at what we've been doing in terms of radiation protection, how much we were allowed to get over the years in terms of millisieverts per year when we first started and we didn't know what the heck we were doing until we figured out something's going on here if we get too much. We've been lowering and lowering and lowering and lowering the regulations until we're down to here where we're sitting at around 20 millisieverts a year as the current regulation. And you look at the cost that it incurs to have safety at this level and look at all these different things. I look at highway safety, National Highway Safety Administration. It costs about, per life year saved, 0.11 million, so 110,000 per person that you save. But you go all the way down the list till you get into the radiation control, emission standards, NRC. We're dropping about $3.8 billion per life saved using these standards, which some people...
Per life year saved.
Per life year saved, yeah. So you're looking at a significant investment in money, and some people are starting to argue, have we gone too far with this? Are we spending a lot more money than we need to? And these are all hypothetical lives that are based on an LNT model. So again, I can see in the next 10 years or 20 years we're going to have some serious challenges to a lot of the things we do with respect to radiation protection. I believe that's my last slide. So in conclusion, you have to say that we have biological defense mechanisms that protect us against high doses of radiation. This is what happened when the atomic bomb survivors were irradiated. They were irradiated. Lots of damage would happen. Many of them survived because they had defense mechanisms to keep them alive to see tomorrow. But it involved a risk that we saw 10 or 20 years down the road, or even 30 years. The risk was, well, you might get cancer, but the benefit was we're going to keep you alive today and for the next 30 years. That's the defense mechanisms. We have them. They work great at high doses. At certain doses, there's too much, we get overwhelmed. They become lethal. And then at the lower doses, I say we have these genetic response mechanisms that are adapting daily to all sorts of perturbations and changes in our systems. And when we get a chest x-ray, or when we get a little bit extra background radiation from something, or we do this, our body adapts to it. Because like I said before, radiation is just causing free radicals and ions to form in your body. They happen all the time when you breathe air, you breathe oxygen, you exercise. We get hundreds of these things happening every second. And our body just deals with them through our defense mechanisms. So I call these response mechanisms to low doses. And I always put on my apple and orange, so people shouldn't get the two confused, because they're actually two different things we're talking about. High doses, defense mechanisms; low doses, response mechanisms. That's the end of my talk, except for we're all done picking ice wine. In fact, ice wine was really bad this year in our vineyards. We hardly had I think we got a couple of days where we got to the minus. We got all the ice wine off, but that's just a picture of us picking our ice wine in our vineyard in Niagara a few years back. Anyways, hope that gave you some information, and